Storytelling is important in business just like it's important in real life. Story is important because it's how we make sense of the world around us. Storytelling is essential. Storytelling is what bonds us. Stories are how we make sense of the world. Every single human being constructs their entire world with story. Stories resonate with us. Without story, we can't communicate and we can't understand. Even a loving embrace and a hug that gives you a deep, warm feeling is giving you a deep, warm feeling because you're putting that into a story in your mind about what that means to you. Stories connect in a way unlike any other information. You will communicate in a way that people not only understand, but care about. A data sheet or a PowerPoint presentation that isn't fueled by story is nothing to care about. A great story affects you. A great story affects you. A storyteller will know that their message is connecting with an audience because that audience will lean in. And when people lean in, they want to know more, they want to engage, and they want to act. Storytelling is important in business just like it's important in real life. Stories are literally the bridge between people. The bridge between people. Storytelling is what bonds us. Stories are literally the bridge. Stories are how we make sense of the world.
Hello and welcome to Friday, unless you're watching this as a recording, and then it could be any day of the week or a day of the week that you could even make up. So interesting week this week, really fantastic. Just came out of a critical point within a client's narrative project, and I always get so excited when it gets to this point in the process. You know, there is such a confluence of information and of factors when it comes to creating a story, creating a narrative, right? Because quite frankly, your business, you've got so much stuff in your business, and that's exactly why I formed Go Narrative. So we help companies, tech companies, tell their story, and one of the key ways we do that is in building narratives, strategic narratives, tactical narratives. And I started on this journey, well, the journey itself started a long time ago, but I started on the journey of Go Narrative in some ways before I even left the corporate world, and so much as my first official job, getting paid as a storyteller, seeing as I haven't got my novels published yet, was being chief storyteller for one of Microsoft's business divisions. And it was in that experience that I discovered a whole cacophony of issues with trying to tell stories in business. And that complexity of information is one of the key challenges, right? We want to tell a story. We understand the value in telling a story. And through our attempts, we get wrapped around the axle. And it's painful, right? We have this vision for telling a clear story. We watch the TED Talks. We hear about brilliant business storytellers. Steve Jobs is one who's thrown around a lot, obviously, but you know, Scott Galloway, for example, is another one. from a different perspective, obviously, is as more of a sort of professorial perspective. But we've got all these ideas about what we want to do, right? We want to be as engaging as that. And we sit down to try and figure it out, and we get wrapped around the axle. We see all these things that we want to say, and then we've gone and we found some tools, right? Some Hollywood tools, or the hero's journey or something. We're like, how do I, am I the hero? No. Is my customer the hero? Is hero even the right word? How should I be thinking about how do I include myself in this? And before you know it, it's just too much. It's another area of expertise that you're having to worry about on top of your business, your products, your offerings, your team, your partners. And we default back to the more functional aspects. And in fact, I had this conversation this morning with a client who is super excited about where they are on this journey to create their narrative. And they said, the problem that I've had is this functional aspect, always opening with a functional. So I'm comfortable, right? Because we are comfortable there. And it was the same for me when I started doing business storytelling, right? I was comfortable in the product knowledge and the company knowledge, and is a trap. But my job was to try and figure this out. And I tried to take our team on the journey with some of these storytelling approaches, and kept bumping into this exact problem, right? Don't have the time to think about this, don't try and educate me, right? Which was an early learning for me. Nobody wants to be educated, right, about this stuff. People just want to take it and run with it, right? Give me the secret, give me the key to help me unlock it. And as a result, I ended up playing kind of interpreter, if you will, story interpreter between what we were trying to say and how to say it. And it was fine. It was fine. We did some fantastic storytelling. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that the opportunity for me personally was to help more than just one company. And that was the genesis of the idea to form Go Narrative. And the funny thing is, it's the same thing every time, every project, right? Somebody's come to this realization that they're stuck in the functional, just like this client that I mentioned. They're stuck in the functional. They see the value of being able to tell a story as powerfully as they've seen on these various YouTube examples, right? From nowadays and from history. And they didn't know how to do it. And what we do is we give you that one story to tell. And but it's more than that. It's more than just us giving it to you. It's that process that we go through with you, which is a really fascinating process. And in fact, you kind of have a spectrum of folks, right? Some folks are just, and the way it happens, the way it goes down, right, is they describe the functional aspects. We take it, think it through in terms of how the best ways to tell the story in the context of what's happening in the world, right? What their audience cares about. And we come back and we play it back. And either it's like, got it, fantastic, or I can use that, right? And thanks, and we're gonna go with it. And then the other end of the spectrum is the folks who have a deep interest in getting the story right, and have a lot of concern over making sure that the right things are represented in the story. And to be honest, more people than not gravitate towards that end of the spectrum. When we have a team of experts, like a leadership team, it's really far down on that end of the spectrum, right? A lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, often pretty good storytellers, natural storytellers themselves. We're all natural storytellers. Some of us happen to have spent more time doing it than others and have refined it so that we can be of service to others. And that brings with it a lot of feedback, right? Here's our proposal for how we should be telling the story. And sometimes that is tuning, and sometimes it's wholesale changes. And the way I like to look at it is, what do you intend, right? What are you intending to get across? And then, is it coming across as intended? And so those are two what sound very similar, but are very different as well. And this current client that I've mentioned, they had a great way of putting it. And it's the leader of the team. And they said, is it true? Right? And that's is it what we intend, right? Is it true? Is there truth in this? Can we agree on there being truth in this, right? That's kind of the first step. And then after we've agreed on this being true, how do we want to communicate that? And that can seem pretty cut and dried, and it can be. But one of the really interesting things that I noticed in this project, right? Sometimes you just kind of zero in on realizing something, is as we have been talking about their audience, as we've been talking about the world, right, that this narrative is taking place in, we had talked about the impact that some of the players in this world, some of the companies in this world have been having, and they're pretty negative impacts, right? And for example, think about, let's see, what would be a good example? Without, we don't want to reveal any secrets at this point. Otherwise, I'd be telling you their name and everything. But if we give an example, for example, let's say social media, right? And social media companies, what they've done has had an impact. You could, arguably a negative impact. Hence why some of us, you'll truly quit Facebook, right? And so going back to the story, we've got this part of the narrative that is happening out there, that is these players that are doing this stuff. And that is directly connected to the offerings of our client, right? It's different, right? But there is a relationship. There's a shared part of this world. And we leaned into talking about these impacts, and it was too far. We went too far in that direction. And it created a reaction and feedback, which was effectively, if we talk about that, we're actually going to distract from this element that we really want to focus on. So that was super helpful, right? Because that synchronous interaction about the reasons and the discussion allowed us to then figure out which parts of this make sense to keep. And in doing so, we were able to retain that connection to this thing that was happening in the world that everybody understands, right, within this audience, and quickly then focus on the actual challenge that the audience has as it directly relates to what our client does. And I love that process. I love uncovering these things. I remember I had this presentation training way back in at Intel, when I was at Intel, and I remember it was about presentations and everything from the key points you make on a slide, if you've got slides, to how you open it, right? There was a bit of storytelling actually involved in the process, so I loved it. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name who was doing the training. Bob said, start as far to the extreme as possible, right? Go hog wild, go crazy, and then dial it back. It's much easier if you go really far and then dial it back, as opposed to being safe and then trying to add a bit. And that's what happened in this particular example. We leaned way into this concept and then kind of dialed it back. And that's something I would encourage you to do as you think about your story, right? What are those big things that are going on in the world, like really big impacts as it pertains to your audience, and as much on that world stage as possible, right? So the social media example there was a relevant one. If you're talking about social media in general, or the journey that social media companies have gone through, where they are today, then that you want to be talking about that playground. You want to be talking about, sometimes I'll say sandbox. So think about what that grand stage is that there's a connection to, right? And then identify what is it specifically that we help with as a part of that, or that we're doing that is on that stage, even if it's not the bigger issue. So some of the things we could think about today, I mean, if I was actually even just to pull up the news, right? Pull up the news and see what's the Hurricane Lee on track to swipe parts of New England. Okay, well, that's nature. Politics, not talking about that. Let's see. Here's a Wall Street Journal article: the 100 billion luxury complex that's sitting empty and unfinished. So this is the type of thing that I would be hunting for if I'm building a narrative for, obviously, the construction industry, potentially the travel industry. I'd look into, I'm not going to read the article in front of you here, but I could share it actually, could do a screen share, but anyway. So this is the big stage, right? So this is, the big stage here is throughout and after COVID, there's been a building boom. There's been, we all know about this because there's limitations on supply chain. Property values have gone up. Interest rates have gone up for mortgages. There's a whole big world stage that's going on here. And then a part of that stage is this luxury complexes. Tell me about luxury complexes, right? Why is, what is it about this part of the stage? And then they've got this, like, this very juicy, interesting part of the headline, which is the 100 billion and empty and unfinished, right? So that could be something we could use for, obviously, the construction industry, but we could use it for other things as well. We could use it for Zoom could use it. Microsoft Teams could use it. Cisco WebEx could use it. Why? Because they could be talking about working remotely, hybrid work. They could be talking about collaboration. They could use it as a proof point that, because we're talking about a luxury complexes where people live, that all of the investment that's happened in housing because of COVID, post-COVID, because of this hybrid work culture, and because of the backlash to that's happening now, is this rationalization of who do we get into the office, how often do people have to be in the office, what are our mandates for that? It's causing an impact on industries like this. And it's also causing an impact on our industry of video conferencing and remote work. So here what you've done here is you've identified this world stage and you've found a way to connect that to the story that you're telling, because you know that people get that. It's an easy on-ramp to your story. Where that could become a problem is if you talk too much about luxury housing. It's not really relevant, right? You could lean in too much to that. And so, as an example, that's what I did. I leaned in a bit too much to that because it sounded like it was something that was vital. Turned out that it was a little bit off the mark, but it was in the right direction. So I love where we get to where we are now in this particular project is all of that's come together. We've got the right amount of detail of the big stage, and then all of the detail of the story around the more specific part of the stage, if you will. So that's something to think about as you go through this process of sitting down and trying to figure out, like, what story do we tell? Because it can be tough, right? You look at Hollywood Heroes Journey, you look at all these TED Talks and these YouTube videos, and you've got this vision of where you want to go to, and it's like, how do I put this together? It can feel really overwhelming. So what I would encourage you to do is focus on what you can control, right? Think about those kind of almost like a Russian doll of nested stories. Like the big doll is the ultimate biggest doll is the entirety of human culture. And then it goes down to a part of the world, to a technology or a business type, a technology, and all the way down into whatever it is that you do, right? Deeper and deeper and deeper. But just think about your part of that Russian doll and use the whole Russian doll as a context to help you channel what you're thinking about as you build your story. And that's exactly what we do with these narratives, right? Is you get through our Story Accelerator program, you get these two key deliverables. Our strategic narratives is a little bit different. So the Story Accelerator is a 6-week tactical engagement, but you get these two things out of that. And then the strategic narrative work it's a little bit different. Won't go into that just now, but if we think about the two outputs from the Story Accelerator, I can actually show them to you. Just going to give you a sense of what these are, and share the okay. So this is actually a real story guide on the left from a client who's been redacted a lot of the information, so you can't kind of decode it. And our tactical narrative on the right. And it's a tactical narrative because it's about the one story to be telling right now. Strategic narrative is a little bit longer term, a little bit bigger picture. And what the tactical narrative is, supported by the story guide, is that one story that you have to tell. So you don't have to think about storytelling. You don't have to think about how to structure it. You don't have to start from scratch every time, right? You don't have to look at Apple News that I've got. Yes, I have an iPhone, and do all of that, right? Because you've already gone through that effort. You've done the due diligence, and of course, in this case, we've helped you put all that together. And then you've got that one story, and everybody can tell that one story. So focus on this. Focus on this. So whether or not we help you, make sure that you are coming up with that one story to tell and being practical, right? Because this is practical. This is practical stuff, right? This is something, it's tangible, it's physical. You can go and use this. What we do as a part of the process is we help you do that initial example, like the opening of your TED Talk, if you will, to show how your narrative is starting to come to life with delivery. And you can also imagine how some elements of this can be lifted from the narrative and dropped onto a web page, or lifted and then used to inspire some copy that goes on in a campaign or in an advertisement. You can imagine how you would use this with an agency of record or an internal agency or a marketing team to be the foundation for campaigns that you're running. And all of those efforts use this one thing, right? So it's this one focused story. And as you can possibly see, the beginning of the tactical narrative here is you need to, on the right-hand side, this Go narrative one, is you need to start somewhere. The right story improves everything, okay? Then the best connections in life and business are through stories. Every company has a story. So this is 4 paragraphs in before we've even mentioned Go narrative. To be perfectly honest, it's a little bit too soon. The client that I was just talking about, we have this absolutely beautiful, like half, just under half of the narrative is about what's going on, right? And that means that when they're telling that story in their own little TED Talk or wherever it happens to be, when they're telling that story, they're telling that story, right? And whilst this is our story, right, it's actually all of our stories. The audience's story, it's our story, it's the story of more people than are even in the room. and we can all identify with it. We can all feel it, right? Like the social media, Facebook destroying governments, cultures, whatever example, or the luxury housing example. All of these things are ways that we can approach that. So the challenge is it's funny. I was thinking through other sort of story that would bring this to life, and there's this parable quote. No, it's not a parable, but it's a ancient Chinese. I'm a big fan of all the like Sun Tzu and those types of things. So tell me and I forget. Show me and I might remember. Involve me and I remember. And I love that, right? It speaks to that experience. It speaks to when we watch a YouTube video to do some plumbing in our house. That's showing us, but also we're watching that, we're doing it at the same time. It's kind of like a coaching little experience involving me. But there's something else that involves people. Stories. I was listening to the Blink for Story Factor by Annette Simmons this week, and she had this great way of framing. She talks a lot about the why we should tell that you should tell a story, and instead of instructing somebody, tell them a story, which is totally agree. Where people then fall down, though, is what we've been talking about. How do I do this? How do I actually go and tell it? Like, I've got all this stuff I have to worry about. You don't if you've got your tactical narrative. But she says something that I really, really like, and that is story is a simulated personal experience. It made me think of Will Storr and the science of storytelling, and how we're in here, right, with this brain trapped in this pitch dark skull with it's kind of scary when you start to think about it. And then we've got these senses, right? We've got these eyes and these ears and smell and taste and everything that is measuring the world around us and then building this picture in our minds. And it's actually a simulation. I'm not going being like sort of like wild and sci-fi talking about the Matrix or anything. I'm literally talking about what the brain is doing. It's simulating what's around it based on the information it has. So we're already doing that. And this is why the story you tell yourself becomes reality, as Chris Hemsworth says on the first episode of Limitless, where he's exploring stress and having a relationship with stress through extreme things like climbing, so that you know that, and drowning, that was a really scary part, really stressful one to watch. Because you've gone through these stressful experiences and you've been okay, now you're in this job interview or this challenging thing you're doing with work, and you can find a place of peace, right? And he says the stories we tell ourselves become reality, and that's because it's a simulation. Therefore, if we put the effort together to come up with a story like a tactical narrative, and then we start telling that story, it becomes reality. And in this case, what that is, taking that housing market, the 100 billion of luxury complex that's still sitting empty and unfinished, and talking about a bit of the big picture, and then the more specific picture that we're all in, and the challenges that gives us, and the things you want to do and to achieve within this thing. We're leading people down from a big story down into a very specific story that's about them. And then we say, if it's an actual specific engagement that's going to lead to talking about what we do, we then maybe talk about ourselves. But if we stick with the TED Talk idea, the stump speech, the speech at the event, the keynote, right? We don't have to say, and we do this to help you, right? People will come up afterwards and say, "Oh, that was blah blah blah, CEO of this Acme computing situation, brilliant, amazing, want to speak to them, want to know more. They get it. They get it, the big picture. They get it, what we're dealing with. They get me. And so having that one story to tell is incredibly powerful with that. And you want to make sure that you're making those connections. So absolutely, love that process of going through that. And it gets to a point where all these things coming together and crystallizing and becoming very pointed, and absolutely fantastic. So I said I was thinking about another story, another example of kind of what this can feel like, and see if this is working. Okay. I love to go and dunk in the cold waters of the Puget Sound. Started doing this about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. Some friends who were doing it. There was a polar plunge that we heard of people doing. And if I share my screen, share the other one. Okay. So I'll show that in a second. So we start doing this polar plunge thing, right? It's crazy. Oh my goodness, like January the 1st, and all these people are going down and going into the water. And I was reminded of, I should show the picture of this, would be kind of funny. But it's me in a robe, I guess. It was me and my groomsmen and my father on the morning of my wedding, and we had decided we were going to go for a dunk in the Pacific Ocean, and we did, and it was incredibly cold. So I'd done it before, so I knew I could do it. Kind of to that Chris Hemsworth thing, like the stress, you've been through the stress, so you can deal with the stress that you've got in your daily life. You've dealt with extreme, so you can deal with the extreme daily. So I knew I could do it, and so I psyched myself up and I did it. And then we went again. We started going more frequently, and so we go in and like in December and in January. In fact, some of my favorite times to go in the water when it's colder. We do wear wetsuits, by the way, at that time, most of the time anyway. And I was doing a dunk the weekend. We did like 3 days in a row, and it gets a bit addictive. Did it yesterday. It was like just did it at lunchtime and just was buzzing for the rest of the afternoon, this natural high. And so last weekend we were doing it with some friends, and I was chatting with them. And here's where we'll have some fun doing a bit of drawing. And so you've got the beach, right? So beach is kind of like that. And let's make it more dramatic. There we go. And you've got the water. And I said to my friends, it's like every time I get into the water, every time, just my legs to start off with, right? January the 1st this year was like a run and go in. Amazing drawing here. So I said to my friends, I said, every time I get in, it's like this shock, this cold shock. I'm like, what am I doing? And then I take another step forward, and I'm a bit deeper. Or did I get taller? That's no good. So we go a bit deeper, and the shock is starting. It's still there, but it's starting to subside. I'm starting to acclimatize, right? I'm starting to get used to it. And you basically go down. It's like if I was to draw like down here, that's way too big. It's kind of these different levels, right? So you've got the cold shock that you initially have right here. You're like, oh my goodness, right? And then it's a little bit more, and then it really hits you when your waist goes in. I'll tell you that much. Like, ooh, something's really cold now. And then you again have that kind of sense as you get to here. I find that I want to keep my arms out for as long as possible. I'm kind of holding out, right? My hands, getting my hands, something about putting my hands under the water, and I kind of get cold hands anyway. So putting them under the cold water. So I'm kind of like this. And eventually I put my hands in, and interestingly enough, there's kind of a similar connection to what's happening here. What's happening here and what happened with this level, because there's this, like when you first go in, you're like, what am I doing? You put your hands in, and there's that initial feeling that also feels like when you first started to get in. And then after you start to get to that point, you can do what's really fun. You can lie on your back, get your shoulders in, and start to kind of soak, right? And then after you've soaked for a while, then you gotta do a dunk all the way in, and then before you know it, if you're like me at least, and you like to swim, you're off doing some open water swimming, right? And this is very much like what it's like to try and do storytelling in business, right? This is your biz, right? And you as an individual, because we all have lives and careers to worry about. And it's also anything we do, our offering, right? Like our products. So we that represent all of that coming together to go into what is effectively storytelling, right? Or story. Because story is about the telling, but it's also about the building, like I was talking about earlier. The process that we go through to figure out the big stage, to zero in on where we're going. And so it's also, it's also the brain, that simulation that we're doing in our brain. All of these things, right? It's not just the telling. And this point here is kind of interesting, because this is immersion. At this point, you've taken everything you are and what you're doing, and you've immersed it into a story. But you're not quite swimming just yet. And those final steps of getting it refined, that's where you're off to the races, and you've really got your narrative all sorted, mixing metaphors a bit. But you've got it dialed in, and you're ready to go, and you're swimming in story. But it's still you, right? Yes, you're swimming in story, but it's your story. It's the story of your audience. It's the story of the market, or the area that you and your audience are all playing in, and it's the story of the world, and it's the way of telling that has somebody listen from the other direction, right? World, area, audience, potential customer, you, right? And that's one of the challenges with a lot of story attempts. And I would even criticize, I'm going to redo that narrative, because if you think about this as being the story, right? The kind of the one page, if you will. So many of us immediately get into what I call practitioner space. In fact, a client this morning used the term, did they say practicalities? I think they did. Noticing a bit of a pattern there. This is like the safe space, right? Don't worry about the stories. Don't worry about fitting this into the big picture, worry about understanding what we do, how we do it. This is really compounded, by the way, by these things. We're all trying to get by, right? Think back to that first job. I think back to one of my first jobs after university, where I was working in sales at Intel, and having to know the product, having to know all the products, right? Because it wasn't just about our processors and our motherboards, it was about what Dell was doing with that. I still remember even one of the senior sales guys talking about how he won this huge deal. It was either BP or IBM. And he told me the story of how they won the deal, how he won the deal. And it was effectively what he said is, I did not sell them on our products. I didn't even talk about our products. I talked about the amount of energy they were using in their data centers. And we spent a whole bunch of time talking about that and talking about the big picture and why this is happening and where people think this is going and all of the trends, all this kind of stuff. And the massive deal, because there was some nominal benefit for energy for the Intel processors that when you scaled it up to the size of a data center was a huge amount of power savings. And that power savings had two impacts, right? Budget, how much you're spending on that. You could be spending on other things such as product development, and the environment. Those are the early days of companies actually starting to set environmental goals. And so the reason why I tell that story is because at the time for me, I was drowning in this space. I wasn't swimming yet. And that's one of, another thing you can take away from that swimming story is not just about swimming in story, it's about swimming in any topic, right? To start off with, it's like cold and it bites you and you're not sure. And then you take another step in, you get a bit more comfortable. You eventually can dunk yourself into it and then you start swimming, right? And so we're doing that with our jobs. And so thinking about doing that with stories is another thing to worry about, which is why we love helping with that, because we can help you come up with that narrative, that story, take you through the process, but you don't have to worry about the storytelling, and it's constructed in the right way. And then you can ultimately use it to swim in story. You're going to cheat in a way. But what we see is, and what you saw in the tactical narrative I shared, was where do we start talking about ourselves, right? And unfortunately, the kind of de facto is having let's call this the P, is up here. What do you do? I work for a division of Sony, and we are responsible for all of the voice recorders, all the voice recording technology like dictaphones and all that kind of stuff, consumer ones, business ones, high-end ones for journalists, and even starting to move into the recording and the artist space. And here we are talking about practitioner space, right? And that is, if you think about the narrative I showed, and where Go narrative is mentioned, it's like kind of there, right? When we start talking about the practice, but actually, really, what you want to be doing is you want to push the P as far down as possible, right? It's kind of like the extreme example I gave with the presenting training. The further you can push this down, even, let's imagine this extreme example. So extreme, it's off the page, okay? So imagine you've pushed this down all the way off the page. What is this? What is in here? Well, we talk about that big stage. The example we were talking about with the luxury complex that's sitting empty and unfinished, we're talking about things like COVID and remote work and real estate and construction industries. We're talking about the big picture. And then we start to get a bit deeper. We start to talk about maybe it's specifically remote work. So we start to dig into that, go a bit deeper into that. And then we talk about maybe the issues that are happening with that. Maybe we tell some specific stories about what are happening in that space. And then we talk about maybe the long-term implications, trends, and where all this stuff is going. And again, we didn't get to the P, kind of cross that out, right? Why would we do this? This seems crazy. We want to talk about the P, right, at some point. And you do need to. You want to create a narrative that includes you. And you can then focus on which part of this story you tell. So if we had, let's say that we actually have the P and we actually start it here. So here we've got big stage, slightly more specific and relevant stage. And then we start to bring you in. By the way, this here, customer pain. When I say pain, it could be objectives, it could be things that you're trying to do, the customer's trying to do, audience challenges. And that's also, let's call it audience and customer pain, ACP. And you basically then transition into this. And then you have all the answers, right? Then you show how you solve for this thing, and this thing. And you're pointing back to these. You're at risk of using storytelling parlance. You're bookending, right? So you're making sure that what's down here answers these questions. So you pose these, you've posed these up here, and now down here, you close, you answer. But you can't do any of this. You can't look at and focus on any of these things, let alone do this, unless you've done this. And you can't do this unless you've done this. And it might be that this is really narrow, that there's a really small thing about the world in general that you use to start off with. Point being, you can't find your way in to the hearts and minds of your audience to answer those questions if you haven't posed them, right? And that's why a narrative works. That's why it's so important to go through the process of thinking about what the water is, exposing yourself to the water, rolling around in the water, soaking, if you will, immersing yourself in it. And it's really your biz plus the world plus story. And that's what the water is. And so when you're swimming, you're telling a story that works in the world that your business helps with. And so that's what effectively the process that we go through when we're building a tactical narrative, which I absolutely love. And in fact, the Story Accelerator, it's a 6-week process that we go through. Share. Okay. We take your story type that you can discover by going to gonarrative.com. There's our business story type assessment. When you finish the assessment, there's the blurb. If you're on a phone, I've realized it's a bit tricky to see. There's a form that you can fill in, and then there's below that, there's the details. By the time you watch this, it may well have changed. But the point is, make sure you read the little blurb, but also make sure you put your email in, right? Yes, that's a way for us to be connected. I think you'll see there's enough value in what you get out of your story type to trade your email. But that series you get 7 days of how to apply this, how to apply your story type. And week 1 happens after that or concurrently with that. So we take your story type and then we build from, we'll show you your story report with your dominant and your supporting type. When you do it online, you'll see your dominant type. If you then book some time to speak to us, we'll show you your supporting type as well. And then we start to move into building the guide, which is where we start to go into that, start paddling a little bit. And then we go several iterations of that, which we, by the way, we absolutely love this kind of flow of listening to your expertise and experience, discussing it, aggregating your ideas, debating those, agreeing, right? That this is what's intended and it's coming across as intended, and then making sure that's encoded for you. In this case, encoded means in the shape of story. You don't need to worry about that, right? And we can obviously help you then go and tell that. But we go through this, it's an infinite cycle, so to speak, because it can go on forever. And we do need to get to a point where we're like, yes, this is good. But we go through this through our review cycle to do exactly what I was saying with figuring out which parts of the big picture, the big world, the grand stage do we touch onto, right? And if we think about the one-page example, that top part of it, and get that right, get the story right, all that good stuff. But it's a 6-week process that we go through, and then we move into the tactical narrative, build out the tactical narrative, which is based on the story guide. And then you have those 2 things to use with your team, quick hit, and then your narrative itself. So there we go. Some storytelling ideas for you from this week, and some of the excitement that I've just personally been experiencing. And I want to go back to that, what I mentioned about Annette Simmons, not to beat her up too much. And in her book, she gives the example, and keep me honest if you've read the book in detail, because like I said, I just listened to the blink. But she moves very quickly from saying, and she gives a specific example. If there's somebody in your office who is sending terrible emails, rather than telling them to stop sending these terrible emails that are rude, but not coming across in the right way, whatever happens to be, tell them a story of somebody whose career was negatively impacted based on emails that they sent. And I agree with that. I agree that will be more effective. I get it. I know the power of storytelling. You don't have to tell me that. I get it. The problem is, what's that story? I like what Paul Smith did in his lead with a story, because he had like lots of specific examples. But this is the problem I've seen with so much advice out there, is how do I then go and do this, right? We talk about the why, the how, and the what. The storytelling, the why being that purpose, the drive, the reason you do this, the how you approach doing it, techniques you use, the what you deliver. And this is a natural thing, but it's also how at the Why Institute, of which I'm a certified coach, we talk about why and how you then apply that. And so I hear these stories like, you should tell a story. Okay, got it. But then it's like this roadblock, right? I know I should be telling stories. I get the why, I get it's important, but how, right? And I'm reminded of this morning. So got up, and my youngest was up. Bless his cotton socks. He was going through his backpack. He was up a bit early today, and he was cleaning his backpack, sorting stuff out. I was very proud of him for being proactive as soon as he got up in the morning. And he then continued. He went and started to work on getting his lunch ready. Great, fantastic job. Well done, buddy. This is really, really great. And he goes to the cupboard where we have the lunch boxes, and he pulls out his lunchbox and he says, "Oh, my lunchbox is here. It's not in my bag or something." Why did he say that? He said that because, as you can imagine, the number of times in the morning we've said to him, "Hey, buddy, where's your lunchbox? You didn't give it to us last night to, get cleaned or whatever, clean it out for you." And so I said to him, I was like, "You understand, like, why it's so great that you could just go to where it lives and grab it and pull it out?" And he's like, yeah. I said, "That's why your mother and I are constantly encouraging you and your brother to put stuff away, not to leave it strewn about the house." And of course, there's been multiple opportunities for us to have this coachable moment with our children, and they're still working on it. And I said, "Oh, I love it. I love it. You've just given me this idea that I have to share on the stream today." And that is frameworks, right? It's when you have a framework, you don't have to worry about what to do. You can follow the framework and you can eventually find success. It's like the recipe, right? It's like a recipe. Recipe is a type of framework. And that is exactly what we've got in our book, our Storytelling for Action Playbook. The Storytelling for Action Playbook is actually, is what it looks like. It's all of the frameworks that we go through. So if you're getting a bit deeper into this stuff, right, then this is something that you can then use to go and apply yourself. The process I talked about with the tactical narrative, we're not making you go through this, right? The strategic narrative is a bit different, and we have workshops and even virtual workshops, thanks COVID, that taught us how to do that better. Where we go a little bit more into this to pull out more of the information and to build a strategic narrative which has got a more runway, right? And it takes a bit longer to build that out, and that's all fine. But like I said to my son this morning, when stuff's in the right place, it makes it easier for us. It removes complexity, it makes things simple, and we can just do what we need to do. Just do what we need to do, right? And the same is when we get your narrative into written form. You've now got it. You don't have to worry. Your lunchbox is in the cupboard, right? And you've got this. You can use it with your whole team to do your TED Talks, your stump speeches, your websites, your campaigns, whatever it happens to be, because you've got it all in the right place and the way it's meant to be. And of course, you're swimming because you're in that ocean of the world and your audience and your company, yourself, and your products. I hope this has been helpful. We'll see you again next Friday. Come along with questions and ideas, or post them after the fact as well in the chat. And I would say, in the next couple of days, think about that big picture. Think about the world that you're in, right? What do you care about? And of course, think about that in regards to your business and your products and your career. What is that bigger stage? And then what are the things that are happening because of the big stuff that's going on? And then use that to tell stories that resonate with other people, because that story that you've been looking for there is resonating with yourself. So not a big homework assignment, nice and simple. Think about what that big picture is and your connection to that big picture, and start telling stories about the big picture and see what happens. So, and then come back next week and tell us how it went. So thank you so much for stopping by. I'm Matthew Widget, CEO and founder of Go Narrative. We love helping tech companies tell their story, clarify their story. If you're in the sort of 50 to 100 employee space, 200 employee space, maybe, and you're trying to go from that practitioner out to that broader audience, you're pushing that, from a $2 million revenue to a $10 million revenue. Reach out to us. Let us know what's standing in your way. Let's try to figure out how to connect all the right dots, so that you can take those steps into that cold water and start to get comfortable, because that's what happens, right? You start to get comfortable and you start to swim. And I won't talk about what happens when you get out of the water, because it can be pretty cold. But anyway, have a fantastic weekend. Have a great week next week, and onward with the storytelling.